paper white, we need to bleach it. So smokers are smoking bleach. It is very difficult to light a cigarette in the wind. So someone has to either cover themselves or they have to, in a sense, cup their cigarette. But once they get the flame to the end of the cigarette lights immediately. And that's because the end of the cigarette is saturated in butane and treated with gunpowder. It's called consumer comfort. They want to make it easy for you to use their product. In addition, the cigarette has these burn rings, and what the burn rings are pretty much tightly wound paper that are soaked in propellants, methanol, butane, and so forth, so it makes the cigarette burn evenly. Fire-safe cigarettes that are in New York State don't have those propellants, but it does make the cigarette burn much more evenly. The front end of the cigarette also has extra nicotine. Nicotine is the drug that people are addicted to. There's extra nicotine in here in the first quarter of the cigarette, and the first 4 drags that a smoker takes from the cigarette is what they usually get to satisfy them. It's called a front end lift. In addition, most of your flavorings are in the front of your cigarette, and flavorings are geared towards gender. If you smoke a male type cigarette such as Marlboro, Winston, Camel, they're going to have flavorings that males tend to crave, such as cinnamon, ginger, licorice, pepper. Whereas a female type cigarette such as Virginia Slims, Capri, Satmores, Eves, and such, they're going to have flavors that women tend to crave, such as chocolate, honey, vanilla, sugars. So if you know what type of cigarette either you smoke or your patient smokes, you may be able to start substituting those flavors. For example, there is a lot of licorice in Marlboro. There's a lot of cinnamon in Camels. So you may want to have that person substitute that flavor for after dinner. After dinner, instead of having a cigarette, you pop a Red Hot. For menthol smokers, the flavoring is down towards the end of the cigarette near the filter. And menthol is actually worse for a smoker for several reasons. The first thing it does is it numbs the pain receptors in the back of the throat. It also relaxes the cough reflex. So by the time a menthol smoker does start feeling those effects, a sore throat or having a cough, any illness they have is usually in its later stages of progression because it's been masked the entire time. In addition, for a menthol smoker, they tend to inhale the cigarette smoke much more deeply because the air sacs expand more. So they're inhaling more deeply, they're taking in more nicotine and much more of the carcinogens. Menthol smokers tend to develop lung disease, lung cancer, or emphysema much more quickly than regular smokers. So that's the flavorings down here. Your cigarette also has methanol, which is a rocket fuel added to it, so it burns at a higher temperature. And because of that, tobacco companies need to put on a filter. The filters came about in the late 1950s, early 60s. And the filter's a good thing and a bad thing because it does cool down that cigarette smoke. There are tiny little holes, ventilation holes, in the filter which draw in cool air because your cigarette burns at approximately 1295 degrees. The body can't handle that considering boiling is 212. This burns at 1295 degrees. So the ventilation holes bring in the cool air. The second thing it does is it filters out that tar. This is tar. This is what the lungs have to process if someone smokes just a half a pack a day, every day in a year. This is what causes the lung disease. So the filter filters out the tar. And you'll notice that when as you get towards the end of the cigarette. So unfortunately, this filter, which is made up of cellulose acetate, it's a plastic that's not biodegradable, is not very good standing up to heat. And approximately 2/3 of the way down the cigarette, this filter that is now saturated with the tar starts to break apart. And those pieces of cellulose acetate are now being inhaled by the smoker. They lodge in someone's lungs and cause lung disease. It's called fallout. The tobacco companies have known about it forever. They say, that's okay, they're adults. They can quit whenever they want. Let's take a look at that statement. That may have been true in the 1950s. During the 1950s, when someone smoked a cigarette, the nicotine that was being absorbed in the body was bound nicotine. It's much harder to absorb bound nicotine than free nicotine. Those are the two types of nicotine in a cigarette. So people were able to quit. During the 1950s also, we saw an increase in what we call chronic illnesses. These are illnesses that take a long time to develop, usually due to lifestyle. So cancers, heart disease, diabetes, emphysema. People started making the correlation between these diseases and smoking, and people started to quit. This was even before the Surgeon General's warnings came out. So during the 1950s, people were able to crush those cigarettes and throw them right out. Tobacco companies started losing money. So instead of going to their ad executives, they went to their chemists and said, you need to develop a cigarette that is almost impossible to quit. So the chemist came back in the 1960s and said, we got it. We can put something in that cigarette that makes it almost impossible for them to quit. And what they added was ammonia. Yes, the stuff that you strip your floors with. And what ammonia does is it releases more of that free nicotine that's in the cigarette. Free nicotine gets absorbed into the body very quickly, gets to the brain in 5 to 7 seconds and hits it like that, very hard. So what's happening, instead of going through the venous system, it's actually going through the respiratory system. What a smoker is doing today is they're actually freebasing their nicotine. There are approximately 10 drags in a cigarette, and if there are 20 cigarettes in a pack, 200 times a day, a smoker is freebasing a drug that changes their brain chemistry each and every time they take a drag of a cigarette, releasing those dopamine and endorphins. And when they quit, that body does not release the dopamine and endorphins in the same amount. That's why it is so difficult to quit smoking. In addition, the tobacco companies need to keep the cigarettes nice and fresh on the store shelves, so they add formaldehyde. Formaldehyde, as you know, is embalming fluid. We also know that there is something called ambergris in the cigarettes. Ambergris is actually whale vomit. And what this whale vomit does is it keeps that sweet smell to the cigarette. So when you open up that pack, that's the first thing that you smell, is the whale vomit.